Hello and welcome to No Room for Extinction. This is part of a series of talks on fashion in the oceans for UN World Oceans Day. And I'm here with Lilian Liu, sustainability strategist at Futerra, and I am Sara Arnold, one of the coordinators and spokespeople for XR's Fashion Action Group. So I'm actually now going to just pass over to Lilian so she can give you some kind of a roundup of, where we are, what is fashion's impact on the oceans, and a little intro about her.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello and welcome, everyone. Super excited to be here. I am streaming live here from Brooklyn in my little backyard room. So my name is Lilian and I am a strategist at Futerra. I work with companies to support their sustainability strategies to make sure that they are contributing to, the environment, to human rights, really being good citizens. And I have a big passion for this. I was doing this type of work at the UN before, at the UN Global Compact, working on corporate sustainability issues. And of course, one of my favorite industries to work with is fashion. I've spent a few years working on textile waste issues in China with NGO redress, and also started my own company in sustainable fashion in Brazil. Super excited to be here. We are today focused on oceans and our precious water resources and the impact that the fashion industry is having. And I guess before we sort of dig in really to that, kind of just unbreaking why we're having this talk right now and what the World Ocean Day really is. The World Ocean Day was actually last month on the 8th of June. We decided to postpone this for a month in respect of all the Black Lives Matters protests, and just to take that time that we needed to dig in as a community. But here we are today, and the World Ocean Day is really, it's been going on for a few years now. The UN has set aside its own SDG just to show the importance of the oceans, and as the SDG language, it's the SDG 14 says, it's about life below water. So, that SDG really focuses on reducing marine pollution, protecting ocean ecosystems, and conserving coastal and marine areas. And around this Ocean Day, there is this global pledge, for world leaders to step up and protect 30% of our oceans, our blue planet, as it's also called sometimes, by 2030. So that's called the 30-30 pledge. And so, that is sort of the bigger umbrella that we're seeing that the global movement is rallying around for World Ocean Day. And the fashion industry certainly has a lot to do and to contribute there in terms of how we can protect our oceans. And our oceans, I know you can see a few facts at the bottom of the stream here. But just to say, I think sometimes because us human beings, we live on land, we forget how powerful and how great the ocean is. It covers about 3/4 of the earth, and it hosts 97% of all our water. And of course, it plays a major role, both for our economic life and for our environment, serving as someone that can absorb carbon dioxide for us. So it actually absorbs about 30% of the carbon that we humans produce. So lots of things in play here. And I think I'll just stop there in terms of kind of introducing the oceans. And, Sarah, I think, I would love for us to get into a bit this discussion about why the fashion industry is important and what it has to do with the oceans. I can absolutely dig in here, but I just also wanted to give it over to you.
So maybe I should start by just kind of giving those headline facts. I know some of them are across the bottom. But the fashion industry is responsible for about 35% of microplastics in the ocean. And I think, you know, as we're on Extinction Rebellion's platforms here, hello everyone, I think we're aware that microplastics is a massive, massive problem, and that it's working its way up the food chain. And so, yeah, 35% of microplastic pollution. And then you also have all the kind of pollution that's coming from rivers through dyeing our clothes, etc. And, you know, it's, I think, important to remember that 65% of the market share of kind of fibers produced is from polyester, and polyester is about 6 times more, it sheds microplastics 6 times more than nylon. And, you know, essentially the fashion industry is being propped up by the oil industry. And so, you know, we have this kind of mass consumption problem, an overproduction problem that is possible because of the oil industry. And I'm sure that Lilian could tell you more about that, but I think those are the kind of headline facts.
Yeah, I think that's a great, you know, kind of summary of what's going on. I think we do have a huge problem with microplastics that we have not been able to solve yet to date, and it is sort of the dirty secret, if you will, of the industry. You know, we talk a lot about solutions and all the progress that we've made, but microplastics is a real scary, dirty issue, and we don't really know what to do about it. I mean, we, as you said, you know, a lot of the microplastics pollution comes from the polyester that we use and the laundry shedding that happens when we wash our clothes. So of course there's a fiber choice we can talk about there. I think what scares me a lot personally is the fact that we have microplastics in like all the water in the world essentially. So, you know, the study showed that it's about in 94% of the waters in the US and about 72% in Europe. So, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. I mean, at this point, it's sort of everywhere. So microplastics, in a sense, is a very almost, you know, not an egalitarian issue, but it's sort of, it doesn't spare anyone, if you will. And of course, we also know from research that microplastics have this nasty ability to absorb toxic chemicals that are linked to cancer and other illnesses. So, you know, there is a very strong public health issue that we need to think about here when we think about microplastics and our consumption of, you know, stretchy fabrics and polyester. And, you know, we've all been very aware about, I think like in the last couple of months, it feels like the world has really woken up to the injustices between global north and global south. I mean, we've always been aware, but now it's just sort of on top of people's mind more than ever. And when it comes to the freshwater pollution that you mentioned, Sarah, obviously freshwater is not ocean water, but the systems are linked. You know, we're basically running out of water that we are able to drink, so the not salty water from the oceans. And by 2030, we're about to have, you know, no more left if we continue on this path. So, and most of that water does come from agriculture and industrial use, and fashion is a big user of that water. You probably heard this stat, you know, to make a t-shirt, you need 2,700 liters of water. I'm not sure how much that is in pounds. I'm still a metrics system gal, but, you know, I think it's something like 3 years of consumption for a human being in terms of water. So not just is it extremely water intensive, there are also a lot of toxic chemicals and dyeing, like the dyeing process and the manufacturing requires quite a bit of chemicals that aren't necessarily being always dealt with in a way that is good for the environment. So, you know, it gets dumped into rivers and lakes where communities live. And, you know, was quite shocked. I recently learned that 8 out of 10 rivers in the world have kind of accumulated all that plastic that we're using. And I was like, but how's that possible? Because we use plastic everywhere, right? And so we've talked about microplastic, but we also have, of course, the issue of like single-use plastics from food and from packaging, etc. And 80% of that stuff, or like in 80% of the rivers, they're in Asia, and that's a lot of these communities are more vulnerable and more marginalized. And that has largely to do with the plastic trade that's going on. So I was kind of mind blown to learn that, obviously, we need to shuffle our waste somewhere, and that's both fabrics and other type of garbage that are going to landfill. And that is being, systematically directed to these countries in the global south. So all that to say is like that becomes a real climate and justice problem when you look at it from a bigger standpoint.
Yeah. Actually, I'll just interject there. Like, I actually take this in quite a personal way because I've actually grown up in Indonesia. I'm actually Singaporean. I know I look very English. Very English. I'm actually Singaporean. I grew up in Indonesia, and I've seen some of those rivers. And I've grown up with the sea being central to my life, the coral reefs being central to my life. I spent my weekends and holidays on the beach. And I've seen firsthand that decline happening. And, I've also seen those communities that rely on fish for the main source of protein for their diet. And there's not going to be a huge amount of other options for them if we end up with no fish left for them. So I think, yeah, to me, it's a really personal problem as well. The other thing that we haven't actually touched on, the huge thing, is carbon emissions from the fashion industry. And so, the fashion industry is about 10% of carbon emissions. There is a lack of data, so we're not really sure quite where it is, but somewhere around 10%. And so if we think about that and the global warming that we're experiencing, in the news just yesterday, it was saying within the next 5 years, out of some of those years, we could be hitting 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. And the predictions are that when we reach 1.5, we see a decline of coral reefs by about 70 to 90%. And at 2 degrees, that would be about 99% of coral reefs gone. So it's also that the fashion industry is contributing to that. And for me, that's personal. And I know that I've been really privileged to be able to see how amazing coral reefs are. And for some people, that feels like a really distant problem. And people don't really understand, well, how is that really going to affect me and how I live? But coral reefs support, I think it's a quarter of all marine life. And 3 million people rely on fish as their main source of protein. So that's this other huge problem. I actually was looking at Pearly on the Oceans, looking at their website, and they work with a lot of scientists. They're a campaigning group, and the statistics that they said were by 2048 seems to be the overall accepted deadline for the collapse of all commercial fisheries. And environmentalists, some of them see that the end of most sea life happening in the next 6 to 16 years. So we're really running out of time, and it's quite scary, really, to think about all of this. And also the rising seas as well. I also grew up in a city that is predicted to be underwater by 2050.
Yeah.
But maybe let's move on to something a little bit. Like there are really great initiatives happening in the fashion industry. It's not all bad, and maybe you can touch on that because, like, what are some of the examples of best practice?
Yeah. No, I mean, thank you for bringing up a hugely important point, and I think we can see that everything is linked. So ocean health is human health, is climate health, is economic health. So thank you for that. Yes, I mean, the good thing is we do see that the fashion industry is innovating and we do see solutions. I wouldn't necessarily say that we're where we need to be, because otherwise we wouldn't have those horrible stats. But you know, if we make a huge push as a society, as a collective, and as an industry, I'm still, you know, I'm an optimist, and I will stay an optimist. And I would say, I mean, when it comes to like the design part or what brands can do, and if you're a designer, like how are brands that are being innovative thinking? I mean, we've talked about fabrics a little bit, so we've touched on pollution, and you know, the thing is, like every month, every week, I see these new startups that are launching new materials, and that are sort of low carbon or based out of recycled material. Obviously, recycled polyester has really grown a lot in the last couple of years, and that's usually made from PET bottles, right? So like the plastic bottles that we throw away. And as much as that's all great and good, you know, 97% of the fabrics that we use to produce clothes are still virgin materials. So it's still not new materials. So I personally think that there's a lot more talk and buzz about all these solutions rather than actual adoption. And that has to do with both an accessibility standpoint. So sometimes it's not always possible to get your hands on those, like, you know, ocean recycled materials, like, but I think we need to try, and as consumers, we can keep demanding better, and that will make brands, you know, essentially force the industry to change because consumers want better, and we're actively asking for it. And another thing that, you know, apart from kind of rethinking the fabric mix, is thinking about circular and thinking about what can be sort of regenerated and stay in value, right? So the idea of circular, I'm sure we all are familiar, but you know, thinking past that linear model and thinking how we can close that loop. And you know, the circular economy has to do with designing out waste and pollution from the start. So not just thinking about it as a, okay, now I have this dress, and how do I now get rid of it in a responsible way? But it's built in from the start. And you know, it's about keeping materials in use, and how we can regenerate those natural systems that we just talked about: coral reefs, oceans, you know, forests. How can we make sure that our way of consumption doesn't hurt those systems? And so I do think that there's a lot that has happened in circular in the last few years. And, you know, like at Futerra, you know, our thing is that we work mainly with businesses. We do work with nonprofits too, but a lot of the time I work with companies and I build those strategies to really set a bold ambition and do something great, and you know, not settle for okay. And I think one interesting example that we did, and this was actually before my time, but I still like this example because it's very linked to the ocean and fashion issue. So what we worked with a company called EcoNil, which is, you know, they make nylon wastes that they recycle from landfills and from oceans. So it could be like fishing nets and other ocean plastics and microplastics. And then they transform that into regenerated nylon. And as you said, Sarah, like nylon has a much lower shedding degree in terms of microplastics and pollution. And also some type of nylon can be regenerated infinitely, which polyester can't, because it actually goes down in value every time you do it. So, you know, in that sense, nylon is a pretty good candidate for that circular economy. And, you know, we worked with Econil, they came to us and they had this great idea and this great material, but they weren't really kind of reaching, like they weren't able to communicate it in a way that was compelling and that really would bring consumers and brands on board. So, you know, our job there was to really transform the brand, you know, find this clear narrative and purpose, because they already had a strong strategy and we believed in the product. And, you know, really make sure that people understand what they're all about and why it's impactful to work with them. And so I think a lot of these startups, you know, they have great products, but they're not getting out there because, you know, people don't necessarily understand, it's too technical. And so you need to really create a brand and build a movement around that solution in the same way that we did with Econil. And now, of course, it's one of the most, you know, I see them coming up a lot in brand collaborations and so on. So I think that's what I can learn from that is you need that great solution, but you also need to be able to get in, like infiltrate that fashion culture in terms of communications and in terms of building that, bringing people with you, if you will.
It's interesting that you're talking about this, because I mean, my question really is that, you know, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's report on textiles that was, I mean, that's quite an old report now, maybe about 5 years old. And they were saying that 1% of the fashion, 1% of textiles is recycled into new textiles, so that it is circular. And 5 years on, how much progress have we really made? I don't know if that's something that you can really quantify or, you know, give any clarity on. But this thing of like, we keep talking about a circular economy, we know it needs to happen, but do we really have time now? It's great that people are doing it, but we also need to learn how to kind of stop all this terrible stuff that's going on and all these virgin materials that are still being produced. Do you have any?
No, I mean, 100% agree that, like, I think everything we consume should be circular and responsible. I don't think we should settle for anything less. But then it is also about dramatically cutting our consumption and the way, you know, fashion culture as it is, and changing that. Because even if we continue, I mean, I don't think it's very realistic that everything, if we can continue to consume everything we do today, that all that would be circular. So we would need to drastically cut as well, because as you said, we're running out of time. But of course, I think we'll still need to wear clothes. Like, we won't be running around naked, I think, in the near future. So we can't just sort of cut everything away from us, but what we do use and wear and consume, it needs to be part of the system where we're not constantly extracting value from the earth, and, you know, and harming people while doing that. But it's true, like the last number that I saw around how much actually get recycled into new textiles is around like 2%. So 1 to 2%. And, you know, a lot of these initiatives that we see, like, you know, buying clothes from recycled PET, for example, that's not an example of circular, that's downcycling. Because, I mean, it's better than using virgin polyester, but because you essentially take, you know, you take a plastic bottle and you make that, like, you break that apart and you make that into a fabric, you're not keeping the value of the bottle, you're downcycling the value. So it's smart to reuse it, but it's not a real circular example. So it definitely is a really, really challenging task. And I don't think that we can, you know, brands can take leadership, and they should, but it is also about having policies in place, having those systemic changes happen at the government level and at the citizen level, to really achieve that. And I think, you know, talking about all this, I mean, I know we've also, you know, I know you guys are doing the Boycott Fashion Initiative, and really working to kind of awaken the consciousness of the public. So I would love to hear you touch a bit more on that and sort of the theory of change around all this.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually just wanted to touch on Greta. She recently did a podcast, and I just want to take a quote from her because, as usual, she puts everything so clearly. She says, you know, we've all been asking, what should we do to avoid a climate disaster beyond human control? But it seems that people have been asking the wrong question or phrased it the wrong way. And it should actually be, what should we stop doing to stop a climate disaster? And I think that is a really good way to explain what we're doing with the fashion boycott. You know, obviously, we're still going to need to buy clothes sometime. We're still going to need some new clothes. Where shoes wear out, you're going to need new shoes. And those need to be produced in a regenerative way, which is possible. But the problem is that most of the fashion industry is basically overconsumption, and we need to change that culture. We are in a system where, you know, we have to produce stuff in order to secure jobs. This is a huge systemic issue. And, you know, the most common question we get is, okay, so you're boycotting fashion. You don't want people to buy new clothes unless they really need to. But then what happens to all the jobs? And yes, you know, this goes back to what Greta said. We need to learn how to stop. This is really the big solution we're looking for, is how to stop. And, you know, the boycott is not just telling people to not buy new clothes. We are part of XR. So we are also supporting XR's 3 demands. And the third demand being, you know, that we have a citizens' assembly within government that would decide on climate and ecological justice issues. And essentially they would just, you know, our second demand is how to get to net zero by 2025. So we do believe that we need to start having a just transition of jobs, and it's a citizens' assembly that would decide how to do that. So yeah, it's really about tackling the culture and tackling these huge systemic issues. Yeah, so that's really the boycott. I'm just looking at the time and thinking, should we start taking some questions from the audience? I'm just going to have a look at some questions. So somebody has asked, will Fashion Week continue? So I'll just say a little bit that as Fashion Action, we did have a campaign to cancel Fashion Week. And this really, it's not just about Fashion Week, it's about what Fashion Week stands for, which is a system of creating obsolescence. And, you know, it's not just about the footprint of the shows, the flying VIPs from city to city to watch fashion shows. It's really about the whole system of excess, and this idea that we need to have new clothes every 6 months, 3 months. And so will Fashion Weeks continue? So at the moment, obviously, with, you know, when we started this campaign, I think everyone thought that we were completely insane. Why would we ask for such a thing? And it's been really interesting that through doing the campaign through 3 seasons, the conversation really changed. And I think people are now asking the questions, well, you know, if Fashion Week never existed, would we think up this system in this day and age. And I think most people agree that we wouldn't. And obviously COVID has kind of brought that to a halt. And now fashion weeks are going digital. And even though that kind of fixes one problem, it does potentially bring up a whole bunch of other problems. If we don't deal with the systemic issues of an economy that that means that we have to produce more and more and more stuff in order for people to make profits and basically create jobs, this is an issue. So where was I taking this? Fashion is, you know, it could end up accelerating consumption, and this could be even worse disaster, but it depends how it's used.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exciting to see that this digital fashion show like a movement, or that people are adopting that to the extent that it has been, and you know that different fashion shows are being canceled already. I know it's due to COVID, but I think that sort of gives us the chance of thinking, oh, okay, maybe we don't actually need those, you know, several shows every year that we're used to, because we made it work that time, and that was actually, you know, a great solution, and that allowed us to lower our footprints. So hopefully we can see some good coming out of that, you know, at the end of the year when we sort of take stock, because I think we're all still in it right now in terms of COVID disruptions. And we did have a question here that I wanted to address around, you know, do we need mainstream circular solutions and alternatives for the everyday consumer? So, and I think that speaks to what you said, Sara, around systemic solutions. Absolutely. I mean, circular can't just be a one-way thing, because even if brands are designing and doing everything they can to build in that circular thinking from the start, they still need, you know, us as the consumer in that value chain needs to play a part in sort of making sure that that material comes back to the loop. And it's also about, you know, the ability to repair and reuse things. You know, to date, most things that we use and wear, they're designed for, they're not designed to last a truly long time. I mean, I think clothes should last at least 100 years. They should go down generations, but, you know, it's only until the next season, right? So one thing I think is interesting, though, is the EU came out this year with a circular economy action plan, and they have some bold suggestions around, you know, making sustainable products really the norm, and really legislating around how, you know, durable products should be, and that they must be easy to reuse, repair, recycle, all that. So, you know, to me, that's sort of sending a signal to brands and the industry to say, you know, you can no longer sort of wait on these issues, because soon it will be policy, and it is already in consideration. You know, this plan is also restricting single-use materials, and so on. So, and it also includes this idea to empower consumers, that consumers will benefit from a true right to repair, which I don't think is the case today. It's sort of, if a company wants to invest, they will, but it should be the norm that this is sort of baked into that consumer experience. Because you can't really say that you care about the environment and still design stuff that, you know, has built-in obsolescence, if you will. So, and again, I think that we are seeing those policy changes, which is encouraging. I mean, of course, it's just, I've only seen this in the EU for now, but that kind of takes me to the question around the citizen assembly that you mentioned, Sara. And I know, you know, the third demand, it also relates to the notion of climate justice. And, you know, I'm just curious, because I know that the report came out recently, right, around that first citizen assembly in the UK. Like, I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit to how we, like, what we saw from that, and how we might potentially leverage those types of contexts for making policy elsewhere.
Yeah, so there was, after the April rebellion, we had, I guess, some success in that the government did decide that they would hold a citizens' assembly on climate change. But what they were discussing was a 2050 target rather than the 2025 target that we had asked for. The other thing is that we had asked for the citizens' assembly to be legally binding. And this one is not. So it will just be recommendations to government. Those results aren't actually out until September, but they did come out with a preliminary report, which basically said that overwhelmingly people had said that the government should use when they rebuild the economy from the COVID disaster, it should be around green initiatives. But I think maybe what's more interesting, considering the main reports coming out in September, is what's happened in France after the Gilets jaunes crisis. It was decided that they should also have a citizens' assembly on what climate change policies should be enacted by government. I think Macron had expected that it would be kind of policies on carbon taxes and things like this. But 99% of that citizens' assembly actually voted for ecocide law. And this is a massive game changer to have a country as kind of powerful, I guess, as I don't really know if that's the right word to use, powerful, as influential as France, to be supporting an ecocide law is really something astounding. And Macron has said that he would be willing to support that being made an international crime. And actually the Pope has also given it his support.
Wow.
And actually, just to bring this back to the fashion industry, I mean, if you look at the practices of the majority of the industry, and when I say majority, I'm talking, like 90-something% of the industry, it is ecocidal. I mean, you've got fossil fuels involved, carbon emissions, water pollution, plastic pollution. I mean, the list really goes on. And when you start getting countries supporting that being an international crime, then I think companies need to start thinking, well, if that becomes an international crime, how are we going to be impacted?
Yeah, that is kind of a wild thought, right? If that law also, has repercussions, because sometimes we know that those international laws can be a bit tied because of the political climate. So I'm super excited to hear that. I think, we are getting a lot of questions in. One, let's see, I'm just looking at them here. So one question is around, what other industries are also responsible for microplastics. I had this crazy, I guess, awakening. I was working on this project for an automotive company, and I realized how much microplastics also come from tires. So tire breakdowns, and obviously tires, they're on public transport, they're on personal cars, and that no one's really talking about that. And I think it's maybe even more than what the fashion industry contributes in terms of microplastics. So of course, the microplastics problem is not just for the fashion industry to solve alone, but maybe we need a coalition with the biggest emitters. So we're saying the tire industry, the fashion industry. We see it from obviously plastic and packaging. consumer goods, and we see it from also cosmetics. Microbeads is largely being phased out from many companies now, but it's still something that do pollute our waters and end up as microplastics that we then ingest. So the fashion industry can't necessarily work in isolation. One other question was, isn't this just like any other industry? We are predicating it on literally buying into ever-changing manufacturing trends. I think yes, and that's why I personally don't only work on fashion, because I know it can't just stop there. I know there's a lot to do, but it's not the only industry that is part of the problem. But that goes back to what we've talked about, Sarah, around fashion culture and buying into those trends or not. And that boycott, this boycott that you are running with is, I think, amazing in that sense, because you're really just boycotting that trend. And if we can start doing that with clothes, with other things in life, we've seen people do that to some extent in Europe with taking airplanes. And we see that train rides are rising. So it's not impossible, but it is helpful to have a movement like someone like Extinction Rebellion that can sort of drive that at a movement level. To feel like you are in it with some other people, and that it is a culture that you're building, and you're not just being a weird person in your friend group.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that I think the fashion industry is so important, and the reason why I think it's so important that Extinction Rebellion addresses the fashion industry is because it's not just an industry, it's also a culture. And it's a culture that has become about kind of creating newness. It doesn't need to be, but it's become that because it's kind of tied in with industry. And, it's kind of been exploited, or creativity has been exploited in order to sell more and more things. And I would say that the culture of fashion goes far beyond our clothes. You can sell a car by making it fashionable, and there's a reason why Mercedes-Benz likes to sponsor fashion events, right? You can put a fashion designer's logo on a water bottle to sell more water bottles. And so I think with the boycott, we're trying to by addressing the culture of fashion, we're trying to address the culture of consumption as a whole. And then trying to address the systemic issues that are around that. And I think the other thing with fashion is that it's kind of almost like the holy grail of all of these systems coming together, in that, it's a prime example of colonization. Where is fast fashion made? It's made in the global south mainly. There's so much slavery still involved in it. All of these things kind of converge with the fashion industry, but it's also kind of, because it's a culture, we can use it to tell these stories.
Absolutely. A friend of mine, Celine, she mapped out those colonial trade routes with today's sort of trade routes, and they're largely the same. So basically, raw materials and parts coming from global south to the north, and then the north selling back those finished products in much higher value, more expensive, to the global south. And instead of silk and tea that we used to get from Asia to Europe, it's now textiles. And so the same systems and the same structures are still in play. It's just sort of different goods. So I don't know what we'll see in 100 years, if it will be other things that we are kind of shipping. But if we are able to break that colonial cycle and are able to kind of get out of that habit of consumption, right? Through, for example, boycotting and saying no, then maybe we're finally able to break those sort of colonial slave routes that are still going on, where we're still exploiting people, making those products and getting those raw materials. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. I think that the fashion industry can and should take a much bigger role now in I think in social justice questions, because we know that so much is produced in the global south, and a lot of the pollution that the industry is contributing to is happening in those communities in the global south. So hopefully, you know, through the last couple of months, that can be a true awakening, and fashion industries can be like, fashion companies can be a real ally. Obviously, with a lot of work, as we've seen, to do internally first, but also to really truly support a system that is just and equitable.
So I think we've got so many more questions, but we're also running out of time. Should we try and take one more, or
maybe we can take a final one?
Final question.
Why don't you pick one?
Oh my God, there's too many good ones. Wait, I'm trying to. Can you find one? It's a lot of work. Now we're on the final one.
I think that there's a question from Jack here around, should we produce natural fiber or upcycle plastic waste? What has more impact? And I would actually like to reframe that question to, again, thinking about, can we reduce the use? Because no matter, even if we use natural fibers, obviously that helps in terms of microplastics pollution, but it doesn't help in terms of carbon emissions or water use. And I think if we have to use fabrics, great if we can upcycle plastic waste, but again, that still leads to shedding and microplastics. So I would say upcycled natural fibers would be a better option than upcycled plastic waste, if I can put it that way. But in the end, it is about, you know, the most impactful is to cut the use. And so, you know, we have this client, this Japanese client that we work with, and they're like a beauty company, and, you know, they were sort of really mind blown why all these other competitors were saying, okay, well, we're going to take these plastic bottles that we have our products in and recycle them. So we're really investing in that. And they were saying, why are you doing that? Because you're creating so much energy into the recycling process. And instead, what they did was design, you know, a thin film for the plastic that was, you know, only 20% of those bottles that the other ones are using. And so obviously when you recycle that new bottle, the thin one, then you also need a lot less energy. So I think that is the type of thinking that we should be having if we're really trying to be resourceful. So it's sort of go at it both from what is the actual fabric and what happens with it, and can we sort of minimize the use?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's actually, there was two academics, Matilda Tam and Kate Fletcher, have come up with something called Earth Logic. And this is basically a way for you to plan thinking about Earth first, before profit and before anything else. And that doesn't mean not caring about people, but working out kind of economic systems so that those support both people through the planet being supported, because we can't support, we won't be able to live without a healthy planet. And it's really amazing how, like, if you just do that, you can kind of actually and kind of stop thinking about our current systems and just think, well, actually, how would we enjoy clothes and wear clothes thinking about planet first? And the main thing is, we need to grow out of growth. We need to think local. We need to think about new centers of fashion instead of these colonial roots. And then we need to be teaching skills to other people, teaching people how to mend things. We need a new way to communicate about fashion and also new policies. And, the kind of examples you could have is like, why not be teaching people how to mend things in your local library? Mm-hmm. And the thing is that we've produced enough textiles that we probably have enough for many generations to come. So really, if you were to kind of neglect the current systems and think about planet first, fashion would be really, really different. And I think that we need to start thinking about what that dreamscape is and how we can then get there. But the real challenge is degrowth.
Yeah, absolutely. Degrowth and, decarbonizing the economy and the industry. I love that. I think we can share some resources after this. The Ecocide Law, we mentioned the Earth Logic and some other initiatives. I think we're unfortunately out of time. Do you want to say a few final words, Sara? Before we jump off.
I'm quite sad that we're coming to the end of this. It's really enjoyable, and I'm really sorry for all the questions that we couldn't take. My final comment is that, we're experiencing the COVID disaster, and the one thing that we can learn from it is that when you're in a crisis, you need to treat it as a crisis because we need to protect lives. And the economy has kind of, in some places, been kind of put on a back step to save lives, whilst, people are dying in millions of pollution every year. And yet somehow those lives are disposable. And we need to treat this crisis also as a crisis, and we can do it. As citizens, that's what we need to be asking for. And as companies, we've got this boycott, but also I think through the last couple of months, we've seen really interesting examples of companies boycotting other companies, and it gets pretty much immediate results. So Patagonia and North Face boycotting Facebook, and also Next, Zalando, and what was the other company? Another company deciding not to stock Boohoo. This got immediate results. So more boycotts, and we actually just need to treat this like a crisis. That's my final comments. And over to you, Lilian.
Lovely. No, I agree. I mean, it's a climate emergency, and that also encompasses the ocean and everything that, we talked about where fashion has an impact. And I think, we need to stop thinking in silos of, this is a carbon emissions issue. This is a microplastics issue. I mean, it is really a global issue, and that requires global solutions, right? Which does, where we need to look at the systems that are in play. So I love that. I think, I highly recommend, everyone who hasn't yet to check out the XR boycott. I know there are a couple of joiners that aren't that familiar with Extinction Rebellion. I think you're doing amazing work, and I'm really excited to see what will be in the Citizen Report in September, and the upcoming rebellion plans that you guys have.
Yeah, maybe I should actually just say very quickly, we have, if you're in the UK, that we have a rebellion planned on the 1st of September, and that is a blockade of Parliament and of government buildings. So hopefully see you there on the streets. Thank you so much for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.